Commander Kilvaris stood 8 feet tall on the bridge of the massive dreadnought Sovereign's Wrath, her 4 golden eyes reflecting the crimson glow of dying planets on the main display. Her chitinous armor gleamed under the command centers, lights as she watched another world burn. The Draknari had perfected warfare over 50,000 years ago. They didn't just conquer worlds, they orchestrated symphonies of destruction. Target acquired, Commander, her tactical officer reported, his voice a series of clicks and hisses. The rebel stronghold on Kepler-4 for 2b shows minimal resistance. Kilvaris examined the holographic battlefield floating before her. 17 star systems had fallen in the past cycle, each one following the same precise pattern her ancestors had developed. First, they would disable the planetary defense grid with electromagnetic pulse weapons. Then, surgical strikes would eliminate military command centers. Finally, they would broadcast surrender terms. Most civilized species understood the futility of resistance at that point. Execute Protocol 7, she commanded, her clawed hand tracing patterns in the air that her tactical computers interpreted instantly. The Sovereign's Wrath was a kilometer-long masterpiece of Draknari engineering. Its crystalline hull could deflect energy weapons that would vaporize lesser ships. The weapon arrays contained enough firepower to crack a moon in half. But Kilvaris rarely needed such crude displays of force. The Draknari way was elegant, efficient, and above all, civilized. She watched as her fleet's pulse cannons fired in perfect synchronization. The energy beams struck the planet's defense satellites with mathematical precision, disabling them without creating dangerous debris fields. The rebel fleet tried to respond, but their outdated plasma weapons couldn't penetrate Draknari's shield. Technology. Another sector falls to our superiority, her aide sub-commander Victor reported, his mandibles clicking with satisfaction as enemy ships powered down their weapons in surrender. Kilvaris nodded, her 4 eyes scanning the battlefield, analytics scrolling across her personal display. Victory had taken exactly 47 minutes longer than expected due to the rebels' stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality. The Draknari way was always efficient. Disable infrastructure, eliminate leadership, accept surrender. Clean, predictable, civilized. No unnecessary casualties, no destruction of valuable resources. No violation of the Galactic Warfare Accords that had maintained peace between the great powers for millennia. Begin standard occupation procedures, she ordered. Medical aid to wounded civilians, infrastructure repair teams to the surface, and diplomatic envoys to negotiate the new planetary government. This was how civilized species conducted war. The Draknari had learned long ago that true victory came not from destruction, but from the demonstration of overwhelming superiority that made resistance pointless. The rebels would be integrated into the Empire, their technology studied and improved upon, their population relocated to more suitable worlds if necessary. In 50 years, their children would thank the Draknari for bringing them into galactic civilization. The communication array suddenly crackled with static, interrupting her thoughts. Incoming transmission, Commander, her communications officer announced. Unknown origin. Primitive encryption. Kilvaris turned toward the main view screen as it flickered to life, showing a cramped bridge that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. Standing in the center was a bipedal creature she had never seen before. Pale skin, dark hair, and only 2 eyes. The being wore what appeared to be a military uniform, though the fabric looked incredibly crude compared to Draknari bioarmor. Draknari. Command, this is Captain Hansel of the Terran Defense Force. The creature said in accented but understandable galactic standard. We request alliance against the hegemony threat. Kilvaris studied the primitive vessel approaching their fleet through her tactical display. The ship was essentially a metal tube with engines attached. No energy shielding, no crystalline hull. Reinforcement, no pulse weapon arrays. Its energy signature was so weak that her sensors had initially classified it as space debris. These humans had somehow survived first contact with the galaxy's apex predators, but only barely. What can your ... species offer the Draknari Empire? She asked, unable to keep the amusement from her synthesized voice. We offer our ships, our crews, and our commitment to victory. Hansel replied with a simplicity that bordered on the absurd. Through the view screen, Kilvarus examined the human captain more closely. He stood barely 6 feet tall with no visible natural armor, no additional limbs for enhanced combat capability, no enhanced sensory organs. Species appeared to have evolved for a peaceful world with minimal threats. Yet something in his primitive eyes suggested a determination that seemed almost dangerous. Her tactical computer provided additional data on the human vessel. Crude kinetic weapons, chemical propulsion, primitive computer systems that would have been obsolete in Drachnary space 50,000 years ago. They were flying in what amounted to a barely controlled explosion with a crew compartment attached. Your vessel appears to be constructed from scavenged materials, she observed. We make do with what we have, Hansel replied without shame. Kilvarus considered the strategic situation. The hegemony threat was a collection of rogue AI systems that had been consuming worlds in the Outer Rim for months. While not a serious threat to the Drachnary Empire, they were causing enough disruption to interfere with trade routes and resource extraction operations. Additional allies, even primitive ones, might prove useful as cannon fodder. She assigned them to Delta Sector, a minor defensive position around a barely inhabited gas mining station. If the humans were destroyed, it would provide valuable intelligence on hegemony capabilities. If they somehow survived, they might actually prove marginally useful. Acceptable, she said finally. Coordinates are being transmitted to your vessel. Try not to die too quickly, human. As the human ship changed course toward Delta Sector, Kilvarus returned to her tactical displays. The Drachnary had allied with dozens of primitive species over the millennia. Most learned quickly to follow Drachnary doctrine and fight civilized wars. The few that didn't usually went extinct within a generation. She had no idea. She was about to witness something that would shatter every assumption her ancient civilization had made about the nature of warfare itself. Captain Hansel stood on the cramped bridge of the TDF Indomitable, surrounded by displays that flickered and sparked with each power surge from the ship's overworked reactor. The vessel had been a cargo freighter just 6 months ago, hastily converted when Earth received its first and only warning about the approaching Galactic War. Exposed cables ran along the ceiling, and the smell of burning electronics mixed with recycled air that always tasted slightly metallic. His crew worked with the focused intensity that came from knowing they were humanity's only hope. Lieutenant Yunji hunched over a tactical console that had been salvaged from 3 different ships, her dark eyes reflecting the green glow of alien data streaming across her screens. The Drachnary had provided tactical information that would have taken human intelligence years to gather ship configurations, weapon specifications, battle recordings from dozens of previous engagements. Their tactics are completely predictable, Yunji observed, her fingers dancing across the holographic display that projected ghostly ship formations in the air above her console. Look at this formation Alpha 7, energy weapon saturation at maximum range, then boarding parties for cleanup operations. Every single battle follows the exact same pattern. Sergeant Taman stood beside her, his weathered face creased with concentration as he reviewed combat footage on a secondary screen. He had fought in 3 different Earth conflicts before joining the hastily formed Terran Defense Force, and his experience with ground combat gave him insights the others lacked. The hegemony forces follow the same patterns too, he added, gesturing at the tactical data. It's like they're all reading from the same manual, following rules that were written thousands of years ago. The footage showed massive alien warships moving in perfect geometric formations, exchanging energy weapon fire at respectful distances while maintaining proper battle lines. Even when ships were destroyed, the surviving vessels would reposition themselves to maintain formation integrity rather than pressing any advantage. To human eyes, it looked more like an elaborate dance than actual warfare. Hansel nodded grimly, his weathered hands gripping the railing that surrounded the bridge's central command platform. He had spent the last week studying every piece of intelligence the Drachnary had shared, and the conclusion was unavoidable. The galaxy's great powers had been fighting the same war for thousands of years. bound by conventions and traditions that treated warfare like a gentleman's duel with predetermined rules and acceptable outcomes. But humans had learned war in a different school entirely, one where survival mattered more than honor, where victory justified any sacrifice, where the only rule was that there were no rules when extinction was the alternative. "Show me our fleet composition," he ordered. The main display shifted to show the collection of vessels that represented humanity's entire military presence in this sector of space. The sight would have been laughable to any galactic military observer. The TDF Indomitable was the closest thing they had to a proper warship, and even it was essentially a cargo hauler with missile tubes welded to its hull and armor. Plating bolted over critical systems. The rest of the fleet consisted of converted civilian vessels that told the story of humanity's desperate improvisation. The Soul Trader had been a bulk cargo hauler that now carried kinetic weapons manufactured in converted cargo bays. The Busan mining rig still looked like the asteroid processing ship it had once been, but its mining lasers had been retrofitted. With military targeting systems, 3 converted passenger liners served as troop transports, their luxury accommodations stripped out and replaced with military equipment. 2 galactic standards, they were pathetic. But Hansal had seen what desperate humans could accomplish. When their backs were against the wall and conventional tactics weren't enough, he had watched human ingenuity turn mining equipment into weapons, cargo containers into armor, and civilian vessels into instruments of war. "Sir, incoming message from Commander Kilvaris," the communications officer reported. "She's transmitting additional tactical data and reminding us to follow standard engagement protocols." Hansel almost smiled. Standard protocols. The same protocols that had kept galactic warfare civilized and predictable for millennia. The same protocols that would get every human in this sector killed if they followed them blindly. "Acknowledge the transmission," he said. "Tell her we understand our mission parameters." He turned to address his bridge crew, knowing that similar conversations were happening on every human vessel in the fleet. "Listen carefully. The Drachnari expect us to fight like everyone else in this galaxy. They expect us to follow their rules, use their tactics, and probably die heroically according to their standards of civilized warfare." Yunji looked up from her console. "And we're not going to do that." "No, we're not," Hansal confirmed. "Signal the fleet. All ships, prepare for unconventional engagement patterns. We're not here to play by their rules or maintain their precious battle formations. We're here to win." The bridge crew exchanged glances that mixed determination with barely controlled fear. They all knew what unconventional engagement meant in human terms. It meant using every dirty trick, every desperate tactic, every lesson learned from humanity's bloodiest conflicts. It meant fighting like their species' survival depended on it, as it did. As the Hegemony Warfleet approached Delta Sector, their sensor signatures appearing on long-range scanners like harbingers of mechanical death, Hansel felt the familiar calm that came before every battle. The alien vessels were larger, more advanced, and infinitely more powerful than anything in the human fleet. But they were also predictable, thousands of light-years away. Commander Kilvaris monitored the situation from her command center aboard the Sovereign's Wrath. Her tactical displays showed the approaching Hegemony fleet in perfect formation, their energy signatures blazing like stars against the darkness of space. She had witnessed hundreds of similar engagements over her long military career, and the outcome was always the same. The humans would detect the enemy approach, form defensive positions according to standard doctrine, exchange long-range fire until their inferior shields failed, and then either retreat or be systematically destroyed. It was unfortunate, but predictable. At least their sacrifice would provide valuable intelligence on current hegemony capabilities. She was completely unprepared for what happened next. The first sign something was catastrophically wrong came when the human vessels completely ignored the tactical formations that Commander Kilvaris had transmitted to them. Instead of forming the standard defensive line that every civilized species had used for thousands of years, the human ships scattered like startled insects across the vast emptiness of space, moving in seemingly random patterns that violated every tactical doctrine in the galactic military database. "What are they doing?" Kilvaris demanded from her command center. her 4 eyes tracking the chaotic movement of human vessels on her tactical display. The ships were breaking apart, spreading across a three-dimensional battlefield in ways that made no strategic sense. Some were accelerating toward the approaching hegemony fleet at maximum burn, while others were falling back and taking positions behind asteroids and debris fields. Her tactical officer, Sub-Commander Thektar, studied the sensor readings with growing confusion. "Commander, they appear to be ... improvising. There's no recognizable pattern to their movements. It's as if they're making up their strategy as they go." On the bridge of the TDF Indomitable, Captain Hansol watched the massive hegemony fleet approach in their perfect wedge formation through the main view screen. The enemy vessels were beautiful in their terrible symmetries, leak metal predators bristling with energy weapons, their hulls gleaming with the same crystalline technology that made them nearly invulnerable to conventional attacks. Each ship was 3 times the size of his converted freighter, and their combined firepower could have reduced Earth's moon to glowing vapor in minutes, but they were also completely predictable. "Enemy fleet maintaining standard approach vector," Lieutenant Yunji reported from her tactical station. "They'll be in weapons range in 4 minutes, sir. They're broadcasting surrender terms on all frequencies." Hansol almost laughed. Now, facing what they assumed were primitive savages, the hegemony machines were following protocol. They would offer terms, wait for a response, then systematically destroy any vessel that didn't comply with their demands. It was efficient, logical, and completely mechanical in its precision. "Target their flagship," he commanded quietly. "It's the big one in the center of their formation." Yonji's hands froze over her console. "Sir, target it with what?" "Our missile." "Tubes?" "No, Lieutenant." "Ram it." The bridge fell silent except for the constant hum of overworked life support systems. Every human on the bridge understood what ramming meant. It was a suicide attack. The kind of desperate last resort that civilized species had abandoned millennia ago when warfare became regulated by galactic convention. Sir Yunji questioned, her voice barely above a whisper. "You heard me, Lieutenant?" "Full speed, all power to forward shields. Taemin, prepare boarding parties with full combat gear." Hansel's voice carried the calm authority of a man who had already accepted his own death.
Ow.
The Indomitable began to accelerate, its crude fusion engines pushing the converted freighter beyond its recommended operational limits. Warning alarms began to sound throughout the ship as structural stress exceeded safety parameters. The hegemony flagship's automated systems, Fault immediately identified the approaching human vessel as a threat and responded with devastating precision. Energy beams that could have cut through a mountain lanced out across space, striking the Indomitable with enough force to vaporize most ships instantly. But Hansel had anticipated this. The human ship's hull had been reinforced with armor, plating salvaged from a dozen different sources, creating a patchwork defense that somehow held together under the withering fire. Sparks exploded from control panels across the bridge as energy discharges overloaded human electronics. The lights flickered and died, leaving only the emergency illumination that painted everything in hellish red. Hull breaches vented atmosphere into space, but the crew had sealed themselves into environmental suits hours earlier. Hull integrity at 30%, Yunji reported through her suit's communication system. Forward shields are gone, but we're still accelerating. The massive hegemony dreadnought loomed larger and larger on the view screen, its crystalline hull gleaming like a technological mountain. The last possible second, Hansal gave another command that defied every principle of space combat. "Hard, starboard, scrape along their underbelly." The Indomitable twisted violently, its damaged hull grinding against the enemy vessel's armored underside in a shower of sparks and debris. But this wasn't a collision, it was a calculated maneuver that brought the human ship's magnetic docking clamps into contact with the hegemony vessel's hull. Clamps engaged, Taemin shouted from the tactical station. "We're locked on. Boarding parties away," Hansal commanded. What happened next would have been impossible for any other species to contemplate. Sergeant Taemin led teams of humans through the breached sections of both hulls, moving through the vacuum of space in simple environmental suits that looked primitive compared to galactic military equipment. But these humans carried weapons that the galaxy had never seen: projectile firearms that used chemical propellants and worked in any atmosphere. Explosive devices that didn't rely on energy fields or sophisticated targeting systems. The hegemony crew consisted of cybernetic beings that had replaced most of their organic components with mechanical upgrades. They were stronger, faster, and more durable than baseline humans. But they had been programmed to fight according to established protocols. And nothing in their programming had prepared them for humans who fought like cornered animals. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, other human ships had begun their own ramming attacks. But these weren't desperate suicide runs. They were calculated strikes using vessels that had been converted into kinetic weapons. The cargo ship Soul Trader had been loaded with refined uranium and industrial explosives, turning it into a massive guided missile that bypassed energy shields entirely through sheer kinetic force. Commander, Kilvaris watched from her distant command center as the human tactics unfolded with growing horror and fascination. The Soul Trader struck a hegemony cruiser amidships, and the resulting explosion created a brief new star that could be seen across the entire system. The enemy vessels simply ceased to exist, vaporized by an impact that released energy equivalent to a nuclear weapon. "They're using their own ships as weapons," she whispered, her synthesized voice carrying a note of disbelief that her translator struggled to convey. "That's not warfare, that's madness." But it was working with terrifying effectiveness. Hegemony fleet had been designed to fight energy weapon duels at respectful distances, exchanging fire according to established patterns while maintaining formation integrity. They had no tactical response for an enemy that treated their own vessels as ammunition and their own lives as acceptable casualties in pursuit of victory. The converted mining ship, to be disabled, broadcasting false distress signals until it was close enough to deploy its mining charges directly against the target's hull. The resulting explosion tore through crystalline armor that should have been impenetrable. As the battle continued, Kilvaris realized she was witnessing something that would change galactic warfare forever. The humans weren't just fighting, they were rewriting the fundamental assumptions that had governed military conflict for millennia. They had taken the civilized art of war and turned it into something primal and terrifying: the hegemony fleet. For all their technological superiority, was being systematically destroyed by an enemy that refused to follow any rules at all. As the initial battle raged between the human military vessels and the hegemony fleet, space around Delta Sector suddenly filled with new contacts appearing on every sensor array. But these weren't reinforcements from the Terran Defense Force, or something far more terrifying to any civilized military observer. Civilian ships were arriving by the dozens. Captain Hyanwu stood on the bridge of what had once been the luxury cruise liner Stellar Princess, now rechristened New Soul, and bristling with weapons that had never been designed for space combat. The ship's elegant dining halls had been converted into ammunition storage. The swimming pools drained and filled with kinetic projectile launchers. And the observation decks now housed targeting computers jury-rigged from entertainment systems. All civilian vessels, this is New Soul Hyanwu, broadcast on an open channel that every human ship could hear. Form up for Operation Sledgehammer. Across the improvised fleet, cargo haulers, passenger ferries, mining vessels, research ships, and even private yachts that had been converted into instruments of war. Each ship carried a crew of volunteers who had left their families behind on Earth, knowing they would never see home again. Engine runner standing by came the voice of Captain Minho, commanding a freight hauler that now carried torpedo tubes welded to its cargo bay doors. Daegu Express, ready for action, reported Captain Wujin from a passenger transport that had been converted into a mobile weapons platform. Jeju Dream awaiting orders, called Captain Yujin from what had been a luxury yacht. Now loaded with mining explosives and guided by a navigation system pulled from a traffic control satellite, the civilian fleet moved with a coordination that defied every principle of military organization. They weren't following any galactic military protocol or standard battle doctrine. Instead, they used tactics borrowed from humanity's entire history of conflict-ancient naval warfare patterns from Earth's oceans. Atmospheric flight formations from aerial combat, swarm tactics from insect behavior, and even coordination strategies borrowed from team sports. Commander Kilvaris watched this development with growing amazement and horror from her distant command center. Her tactical computers couldn't process what they were seeing because it violated every assumption about how space combat worked. The civilian vessels moved like a school of fish, each ship seemingly independent, but somehow coordinated with the others in ways that created emergent tactical patterns. "They're not following any recognizable formation," her tactical officer reported, his voice carrying the same confusion that Kilvaris felt. "It's like they're making up their strategy in real time, adapting to battlefield conditions without any central command structure." The human civilian fleet swarmed the remaining hegemony ships like angry wasps defending their nest. Each vessel was individually expendable, but collectively they created a tactical nightmare for an enemy that had been programmed to fight. Conventional battles against predictable opponents, the Incheon runner approached a hegemony cruiser by mimicking the flight pattern of a damaged vessel seeking assistance. When the enemy ship lowered its shields to provide aid according to galactic warfare conventions, Captain Minho's ship unleashed a barrage of kinetic torpedoes that had been manufactured and the ships converted. Cargo bay using raw materials scavenged from asteroid mining operations. Meanwhile, the Daegu Express had somehow managed to position itself above a hegemony destroyer by using the gravity well of a nearby gas giant to slingshot into an attack position that conventional military doctrine said was impossible to achieve. Captain Wujin's ship opened its passenger bay doors and released hundreds of small drones, originally designed for ship maintenance that had been converted into guided missiles. But it was Lieutenant Soyoung's final approach that demonstrated the true horror of human warfare to the watching galaxy. She piloted the Busan Pride, a mining vessel that had been converted into a single-use weapon of unprecedented destructive power. The ship's processing facility had been filled with nuclear waste from Earth's power plants, combined with industrial explosives and guided by a targeting system that had been programmed with one simple instruction: find the biggest enemy, ship, and destroy it. "This is Busan Pride," Soyoung's voice came across the communication channels with the calm professionalism of someone who had already accepted death. "Beginning final approach. Tell my family I died free." The hegemony flagship's automated defense systems recognized the approaching threat and responded with overwhelming firepower. Energy beams that could have melted a city block struck the Busan Pride repeatedly, tearing through its hull and exposing its interior to the vacuum of space. But Soyoung had sealed herself into the ship's central control room, surrounded by emergency life support systems and manual control interfaces that couldn't be disabled by enemy fire. The mining vessel's crude armor held together just long enough for it to reach the hegemony flagship's shields. When the Busan Pride struck the energy barrier, the resulting explosion released more energy than most star systems generated in a year. The nuclear waste had been arranged in a configuration that created a chain reaction, turning the entire ship into a directed nuclear weapon that punched through the flagship's defenses like they were made of paper. The explosion created a brief new star in the darkness of space, visible across several star systems. When the radiation cleared, the hegemony flagship had been completely vaporized, along with two escort vessels that had been positioned too close to the blast zone. Two more enemy ships had been crippled by the electromagnetic pulse, their systems fried by energies that their shielding had never been designed to handle. From her command center thousands of kilometers away, Commander Kilvaris stared at the tactical display showing the expanding debris field where 5 enemy vessels had existed moments before. Her 4 eyes tracked the remaining human ships as they continued their chaotic but devastatingly effective attack patterns. "Commander," her tactical officer said quietly, "I'm reading massive energy signatures from the human fleet. They're not just attacking randomly. They're coordinating their strikes to maximize damage while minimizing their own casualties." Kilvaris realized with growing understanding that the humans weren't just ignoring the rules of civilized warfare they had never learned them in the first place. Every other galactic species had evolved past the savage phase of total war, while developing sophisticated codes of conduct that made military conflict predictable and manageable. Wars were fought according to established protocols, with acceptable casualties and predetermined objectives. But humanity had been forced to master total war for survival on a world where the only rule was that there were no rules, when extinction was the alternative. "They don't fight battles," she breathed in sudden understanding, her synthesized voice carrying a note of respectful fear. "They fight wars." The distinction was crucial. Battles were tactical engagements with limited objectives and acceptable outcomes. Wars were existential struggles, where victory justified any sacrifice and defeat meant the end of everything worth protecting. The humans had brought war to a galaxy, had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival. The final phase of the battle began with a sound that chilled every human heart, the deep, resonant hum of massive hyperspace engines tearing holes in reality itself. Space around Delta Sector rippled like disturbed water as the hegemony's reserve fleet materialized from the void, their massive forms blotting out entire star fields. These weren't the standard cruisers and destroyers that the humans had been fighting. These were dreadnoughts, kilometer-long monsters that represented the absolute pinnacle of hegemony military engineering. Each vessel was larger than Earth's biggest cities, bristling with weapon systems that could crack planets in half, and protected by shields that could deflect the energy output of small stars, Commander. Kilvaris felt her 4 hearts skip beats as her long-range sensors analyzed the new arrivals. 12 hegemony dreadnoughts, her tactical officer reported, his voice barely concealing his terror. Each one carries enough firepower to sterilize an entire world. By every measure of galactic military doctrine, the battle was over. The humans had fought bravely and achieved far more than anyone had expected. But no force in the galaxy could stand against a full hegemony dreadnought fleet. The civilized response would be to withdraw, regroup, and develop new strategies based on the intelligence gathered from this engagement. But Captain Hansel, standing on the shattered bridge of the Indomitable, with half his crew dead and his ship held together by emergency patches and desperate prayers, had never learned to be civilized. Sparks showered from damaged control panels around him as he surveyed the approaching enemy fleet through a cracked view screen. His ship's hull had been breached in 17 places. The reactor was operating at dangerous levels, and the life support systems were failing throughout the vessel. By any reasonable standard, the Indomitable was already dead. It just hadn't stopped moving yet, Sir Lieutenant Yunji reported from her bloodstained console. "Enemy fleet will be in weapons range in 3 minutes. Recommend immediate evacuation." Hansel looked around his bridge at the faces of his surviving crew. These were ordinary people who had volunteered to leave everything behind and follow him into the darkness between stars. They were cargo handlers and mechanics, students and teachers, farmers and engineers. None of them had been trained for military service. But they had something that no amount of training could provide: the desperate courage of people fighting for the survival of their species. "Open a channel to all human vessels," he commanded. "Quietly, sir. Most of our communication systems are down," Yunji replied. "Then use the emergency beacon. Route it through every ship in the fleet. I want every human to hear this." As the communication link established, Hansal's voice carried across the scattered remains of humanity's first fleet. His words reached ships that were barely functioning, crews that were wounded and exhausted, and captains who were preparing to write their final logs. "All ships, all crews," he began, his voice carrying the weight of humanity's entire history. "We came here to prove that humanity belongs among the stars. Today, we show them what that really means." He paused, looking out at the approaching wall of enemy dreadnoughts that represented certain death for every human in the sector. Authorization code: Unchained. All limits removed. Those words sent a chill through every alien observer monitoring the battle. In the civilized galaxy, warfare had limits. There were rules about acceptable casualties, prohibited weapons, and honorable conduct. But Hansel had just told his fleet to abandon every civilized constraint that had ever been placed on human warfare. What happened next would be remembered, feared across the galaxy for millennia to come. The humans abandoned all pretense of traditional combat tactics. Captain Minho, commanding the cargo vessel Daegu Runner, made a decision that exemplified humanity's approach to impossible odds. His ship had been damaged in the earlier fighting, its hull cracked and its weapon systems offline by Galactic standards, it was no longer a military asset. Minho saw it differently. All hands abandoned ship. He ordered over the ship's internal communication system. This is not a drill. Get to the escape pods now. As his crew evacuated, Minho worked frantically in the ship's cargo bay, surrounded by industrial equipment that had never been designed for military use. He had spent his entire adult life hauling cargo between worlds, and he knew exactly how much explosive force could be generated by the right combination of materials and pressure. The Daegu runner accelerated toward the lead hegemony dreadnought, on a collision course that would have been suicidal if Minho had intended to survive it. But survival was no longer the objective. Victory was the only thing that mattered. The enemy vessel's point defense systems opened fire. Energy beams that could have vaporized a city block, striking the approaching cargo ship repeatedly. But Minho had reinforced his ship's forward section with every piece of metal plating he could find, creating a crude but effective shield that absorbed the worst of the damage. At the moment of impact, the Daegu runner didn't just ram the dreadnought, it exploded like a massive fragmentation bomb that Minho had spent his final minutes creating. The cargo bay detonated with enough force to breach the enemy ship's supposedly impenetrable hull, sending debris scything through space in all directions and crippling to escort vessels that had been positioned too close. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Eugen had led a boarding party that demonstrated why humans had become the galaxy's apex predators on their home world. Her team had approached a damaged hegemony destroyer by using the ship's own waste disposal system as an entry point, a tactic so degrading that no civilized species would have considered it. Emerging inside the enemy vessel through maintenance tunnels that reeked of alien waste products, Eugen's team moved through the ship's corridors like hunting wolves. They carried simple projectile weapons that used chemical propellants, primitive technology that the ship's automated defense systems hadn't been programmed to counter. Each human carried enough explosives to level a building, and they had no intention of taking prisoners. The hegemony crew consisted of cybernetic beings that had replaced most of their organic components with mechanical upgrades, designed for efficiency and durability. They were stronger and faster than baseline humans, but they had been programmed to fight according to established military protocols. Nothing in their programming had prepared them for humans who fought like cornered animals with nothing left to lose. The converted passenger liner, Incheon Dream, commanded by Captain Wu Jin, had transformed itself into something that defied every assumption about space combat. The ship's passenger manufacturing facilities had been converted into a mobile weapons factory, producing ammunition and improvised weapons in real time, using raw materials scavenged from disabled enemy ships. As the battle raged around them, Wu Jin's crew literally mined the battlefield for resources, salvaging metal from destroyed vessels and converting it into kinetic projectiles that could be fired from improvised launchers. They had turned the debris field itself into a weapon, using the wreckage of fallen ships to destroy the vessels that had created it. The hegemony dreadnoughts, for all their technological superiority, had been designed to fight conventional battles against predictable enemies. They had no tactical response for humans who used their own life support systems as chemical weapons, converted their reactor cores into guided bombs, and turned their emergency beacons into targeting systems for kamikaze attacks. As the last hegemony vessel's shields failed under the combined assault of a dozen improvised human weapons, Commander Kilvaris stared at her tactical display in stunned silence. The impossible had happened. The humans had achieved total victory despite being outnumbered 10-1. Outgunned by superior technology and facing an enemy with thousands of years of military experience, the communication array crackled too. Life, with a transmission from the battlefield. Drachnary Command, this is Captain Han Sol. Delta Sector is secure, waiting new orders. Kilvaris looked at the expanding debris field that had once been the hegemony's most powerful fleet, destroyed by beings she had dismissed as primitive savages just hours earlier. She finally understood what she had witnessed. The galaxy had spent millennia learning how to fight civilized wars with acceptable casualties and predetermined outcomes. Humanity had spent millennia learning how to win wars by any means necessary when the alternative was extinction. Captain Hansel, she said quietly. Her synthesized voice carrying a note of respectful fear. welcome to the galactic community. I believe we have much to learn from each other. As the surviving human ships regrouped in the aftermath of victory, their damaged hulls held together by determination and improvised repairs, Kilvaris realized that the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted forever. The humans hadn't just joined the galactic community, they had reminded everyone what war really meant when survival was at stake. The age of civilized warfare was over. The age of humanity had begun. The end.